Welcome back to The Real Story. War. What is it even good for? That's the big question many people are asking themselves as the war between Russia and Ukraine enters its fourth winter. What began as a limited invasion in February of 2022 has evolved into a devastating and grinding war of attrition, leading to the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. In fact, some estimates out there say that 9.5 million Ukrainians remain displaced from their homes, and nearly 13 million people inside Ukraine reportedly require humanitarian assistance, assuming the reported numbers are actually accurate. Meanwhile, the civilian death toll has surpassed 14,000 people, and the summer of 2025, this year, saw the highest monthly casualty rates of the entire year in Ukraine. The human and material costs for Russia also appear to be staggering, creating catastrophic conditions for countless people in both countries with no end in sight. Entire towns and cities have been reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands of pieces of military equipment have been damaged or destroyed. And both Russia and Ukraine have seen significant damage to their infrastructure, including critical power centers. It's a disturbing situation that warrants concern not just for regional security, but for global security, especially when coupled with this report, which says that Russia has successfully tested the Poseidon super torpedo, a nuclear-powered weapon that's like a mix between a torpedo and a drone. Russian President Vladimir Putin broke the news about it on Wednesday, and it comes just days after Russia conducted nuclear launch drills. Now let's break down what makes this Poseidon development just so critical. It's roughly 65 feet long, weighs roughly 100 tons, and can zip along at more than 110 miles per hour for over 6,000 miles. Even more concerning, it can supposedly pack a 2 megaton warhead, and it can't be stopped once it's in motion. So the message here is very, very clear. While President Trump keeps pushing for peace between Russia and Ukraine, Putin is preparing for the worst case scenario, testing weapons that could enable crippling attacks and widespread destruction. So what's really going on here? Are we getting closer to peace or are we not? And where does that leave us as of now? Here with his analysis and answer to those questions is Andrew Day, senior editor of American Conservative magazine. Andrew, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but we now see nuclear weapons being tested. What is your response?
So the first thing that I would want to say is that we haven't quite seen nuclear weapons being tested. What we saw, as you mentioned, we saw Putin made this announcement that they have tested a nuclear-powered cruise missile that is capable of delivering a nuclear payload, and also that Russia has tested this kind of underwater submarine unmanned super weapon of some kind, which is also capable of delivering a nuclear payload. And so Trump has responded to this by saying, okay, if other countries are testing nuclear weapons, he didn't say which ones he was thinking of. He just said other states are doing this. Then the United States needs to do this as well. He directed the Department of War to begin nuclear testing. Apparently, it caught a lot of even close advisors off guard. They weren't expecting this. He made the announcement shortly before the meeting with Xi Jinping. That already was going to be a tense and complicated meeting, looking at a variety of complex issues that the U.S. and China are trying to resolve. So that maybe made that meeting even more tense than it would have been otherwise. And as I said, I think that we need to be really careful in describing what exactly is going on here. You know, nuclear warheads haven't been tested by China, Russia, or the United States since the 1990s. The only country that has actually tested nuclear warheads in recent years is North Korea. And so I think we should be careful about kind of undermining that nuclear non-proliferation regime, those traditions of non-testing. And I think it would benefit America if we didn't resort to testing nuclear weapons, because we already have a pretty good handle on how good our nuclear weapons are. We have really sophisticated computers, like supercomputers, that can do modeling and tell us, just looking at data, how good our nuclear weapons are, what the effects would be if we detonated them. And if we undermine this tradition against testing nuclear warheads, that could actually benefit China, in my analysis.
Please elaborate then more on that, because that's a fascinating point.
Well, as Trump mentioned in the Truth Social tweet or Truth Social post, China is right now behind the US and Russia. Russia has slightly more nuclear weapons actually than the US does, but the US probably has more strategic weapons and probably better, more technologically sophisticated ones. So even though they have more weapons, I guess it's kind of arguable. One can say that the US is kind of the nuclear superpower of the world. China is far behind, as Trump mentioned, but as he also mentioned, they're catching up rapidly. And a country that is catching up rapidly has more to gain from testing nuclear weapons, because they haven't developed them yet, they haven't tested them yet, and they can benefit more than we could by testing them. And as I mentioned, we are in the lead in terms of these supercomputers that can do modeling. The people in charge of our nuclear safety infrastructure here in the United States, they generally say that we don't actually need to resume testing of nuclear warheads out in some desert somewhere. We can avoid that and still have a good understanding of how good our nuclear weapons are. But maybe the last thing I'll say, I don't think that Trump made this announcement because he perceived a scientific need to test nuclear weapons. We should understand that he seems to have perceived a political need to do this. He wanted to respond to Putin's announcements about testing these nuclear-powered super weapons. He wanted to signal his own resolve. Maybe he even wanted to keep Xi Jinping on his toes before that meeting that I mentioned in South Korea.
So President Trump and many people in his administration, directly in his orbit, have been pushing for peace between Putin and Zelensky for months, but to no avail quite yet. I still have a lot of hope. However, I want to get your analysis to the Trump administration's approach. Do you agree with it, and do you think it's ultimately going to be successful?
Yeah, this is somewhat of an unsatisfying answer because I agree with it. I've been broadly supportive of the Trump administration's policy on Russia, Ukraine, and on President Trump's efforts to get that war resolved. But I also am not optimistic that it's going to work because a lot of this is just outside of President Trump's hands, unfortunately. As you mentioned, the Russia-Ukraine war is a war of attrition. I think we can actually think of it as two distinct wars. There's a war on the ground in eastern Ukraine, and then there's a war in the sky. And I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago. I was there during one of the largest drone and missile attacks of the war. And my sense is that their air defense shield is cracking. I feel like I lived through this kind of dramatic failure of Ukraine's air defense. So the war on the sky in the sky is not going well. Ukraine is doing a pretty good job of developing some drones, producing drones, and flying 100 drones into Russia every now and then, with our assistance, by the way, to knock out some oil refineries. But that's not doing as much damage as Zelensky claims. Russia can get those oil refineries back up and running pretty swiftly. They have fuel surpluses that they can tap into if needed. On the other hand, Russia's air attacks are doing massive damage. I like the way that you put it during your short monologue. Ukraine is heading into its fourth winter of the war. The weather is already cold and rainy. Russia's knocking out its energy infrastructure. This winter is going to be really bad for Ukrainians. They're a very resilient people, but I don't know how much longer they can kind of keep that resilience up, given how difficult this is becoming. As far as the situation in the East, as you mentioned, it's a war of attrition. That's really the point that needs to be emphasized, I think, because even though battle lines are holding relatively steady,
Yes.
That's not really the main factor. What matters is which army is losing its soldiers faster, right?
Yes.
And Russia is actually exceeding its recruitment goals. It's having more recruits than casualties each month, at least last I checked a couple months ago when the latest data was out. Ukraine, on the other hand, is having severe mobilization difficulties. They have an acute manpower shortage on the front in infantry units. Their positions are way spaced out, and they're having trouble even getting supplies delivered to them because those trucks and military vehicles just get taken out by drones. So the situation on the front is very bad. And I think that for these reasons, Putin is, one, reluctant to agree to an immediate ceasefire because he knows his military has the advantage. So he wants to wait till he gets a deal that addresses what Russia calls the root causes of the war. And as far as getting a peace deal, he clearly has larger demands that he's willing to stick to that so far Ukraine and the West haven't been willing to agree to.
Wow. It's interesting. We'll have to see how things play out over time, Andrew. However, it's a pivotal moment in the battle. So many casualties and human lives lost. I wish Godspeed to the Trump administration in at least pursuing peace to the fullest extent possible. Obviously, there are certain factors out of his control, as you said, but in the meantime, I want to thank you for your insight and for your analysis today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, in light of Halloween, an elected official will join us to discuss how he plans to bolster public safety for families, parents, and kiddos, keeping everybody safe while they have fun tonight. More details after the break.